Welcome to lecture number 40 in our series on the foundations of Western civilization. This lecture is entitled The Crisis of Renaissance Europe. This lecture actually inaugurates a series of 3 in which we'll talk about the world of the Renaissance. What we'll try to do in this lecture is look at the period from about 1300 to about 1500. Again, as often in the past, nothing too sacred about those dates. They're notional. We'll try to have an understanding of the political, the ecclesiastical, and the material conditions inside of which the phenomenon that we call the Renaissance played itself out. Now, in the next couple of lectures, we'll turn more precisely to that Renaissance phenomenon, and we'll then offer some definitions. For now, let's just say we're going to look at Europe between about 1300 and 1500. Now, right away we can ask ourselves, how should we think about this period? One famous old way of thinking about it, taking a title from inspiration from the title of a book, is the waning of the Middle Ages. So should our interpretive categories emphasize decline, disruption, despair? Another way to look at this is to say it's the dawn of a new era. Should we see initiative, originality, creativity? Well, in fact, both views have long been prevalent. Both views have been applied to Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries. So, as I said, in this and in the next couple of lectures, we'll be teasing out a meaning of this Renaissance phenomenon and Renaissance period. But in this lecture in particular, we'll focus on the conditions of life behind the Renaissance, so that the next 2 lectures can take up that phenomenon itself in a little bit stricter terms. Now, certain very broad trends are very much evident in this period. Certain very broad trends, indeed, that were already evident in about 1300. We can say, generally speaking, that the trends that we saw in the 12th and 13th centuries persist in the 14th and 15th. For example, in areas where there was centralization, we see an intensification of that. In areas where there was fragmentation, we see an intensification of that. The single great political fact of Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries is the 100 Years' War between France and England. So we'll devote little attention to that in just a few minutes. This was on the whole a period that was rich in disastrous problems for the church. Though we have seen that there were problems in the 12th and 13th centuries, this was still an age of triumphant clerical culture and of papal monarchy. Those phenomena were going to be called very much into question in the 14th and 15th centuries. Now, the great facts here are the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, that is to say the time when the popes were in Avignon in the south of France, and the great schism, the great split in the church itself, times when there were rival and competing popes. But we shouldn't view the late Middle Ages in terms of its religious life as only a time of problems for the church. Or we could extend that discussion and say, yes, there was anti-clericalism. Yes, there were perhaps fewer evident signs of reform and revival vitality than in earlier periods, but there were signs of deep religious faith among ordinary people. And we would go far wrong if we missed those. The most dramatic developments of this period, unquestionably, were the demographic and then the economic and social problems that we associate with the Black Death, the great outbreak of bubonic plague. So let's look at politics, let's look at the church and religion, and let's look at demography and economics. Well, begin with the political shape of Europe. I said the great fact here is the 100 Years' War, so let's begin with that. Now, the 100 Years' War, a bit of a misnomer. It lasted from 1337 to 1453, which is about 116 years or thereabouts. The 100 Years' War, anyway, was the all but inevitable outcome of the long-standing enmity between England and France, occasioned by the continental interests of the English kings. Remember, William the Conqueror comes over from Normandy in 1066, retains his interest in Normandy, even though he's king of England. Later on, Henry II builds the Angevin Empire in France. Later on still, John loses a substantial part of that territory to King Philip II of France and so on. But again and again and again, there is this English interest in France and a corresponding French interest in sort of evicting the English. Well, in 1340, Edward III of England claimed the throne of France through his wife, who was a French princess, and as a result opened a war that lasted in one way or another until 1453. Now, it was a very odd war in a lot of ways. There were only 3 major campaigns during this entire period of time. It was a time when there were bands of freebooters rampaging in France who were sort of unleashed by this war, but actually weren't under anybody's particular control, and in fact were probably, it'd be fair to say, a problem for everybody. It was a very odd war in which, for example, in 1429, the Maid of France, Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, appeared and rallied the French after the Treaty of Troyes had very nearly handed France, wrapped up with a pretty bow on it, to England. It was a war in which the English won all the great battles, and at times held much of France. And yet in the end, the English lost the war and retained only a little area in the north around the port of Calais. So the military history of the 100 Years' War, though interesting to historians of the military, is less important to us, I think, than some of the internal implications of this war, some of the internal consequences of this war for both France and England. For France, in spite of a very long period of suffering defeat after defeat after defeat and facing a foreign army on one's own soil, almost none of this war was fought on the sea or in the British Isles. This war was fought in France. But gradually, the war heightened the sense of national consciousness. It began forging something that we might provisionally call France, a feeling of being French in contesting the English foe. There's unquestionably a certain amount of professionalization of the French military that took place over the course of this war. The French almost got to universal conscription. Now, they wouldn't actually get to that point until the time of Napoleon, but they almost got there during the 100 Years' War. Several effective, very effective, forms of taxation were generated and generalized as a result of this war. And again, curiously enough, despite being defeated again and again and again in the early stages of the war, the fact that eventually the French kings won in this war substantially enhanced their prestige and launched the French monarchy on that trajectory of glory that would lead to the Sun King in the 17th century. For England, the war enhanced the role of Parliament. Remember when we left Parliament in the 13th century, it was a sort of an accidentally created institution whose composition and powers were anything but clear. During the course of the 100 Years' War, English kings needed money in order to finance their armies to go and fight in France. The members of the English Parliament became very clever at applying the principle of redress before supply. That is to say, they would say to the king, you want money for this, that, or the other purpose? Fine. First, you must grant us concessions. The Parliament got immunity for its members. The king couldn't round them up and harass them when he didn't like them. The Parliament got the right to choose its own speaker. The Parliament got the right to initiate legislation rather than merely responding to proposals sent to it by the Crown. Slowly but surely, in other words, the 100 Years' War built the Parliament into a much more permanent and durable position in the English scheme of government. Now, Parliament has a long history in front of it still after the 15th century. I don't want to imply that every power and aspect of Parliament is already in place, but we can predict what Parliament's future would look like in, let us say, 1400 more readily than we could have done so in 1300. There was a sense in which the 100 Years' War also, however, distracted the English from certain potentially pressing problems at home. There were problems of religious division. We'll refer to those a little bit later in this lecture. But there were also powerful and deep factional divides in the English aristocracy that were kept in check to a degree by the war and then burst out in its last phases and after its conclusion. These factional squabbles, indeed, issued in a civil war that we call the Wars of the Roses that went on sporadically between 1455 and 1489. Now, if the 100 Years' War was fundamentally a controversy between England and France, it was also true, given the importance of England and France and given their geographical location, that much of Europe was drawn into this war in one way or another at one time or another, and at the very least we may say that trade was often and seriously disrupted as a result of the 100 Years' War. So the 100 Years' War, the great dynamic for England and France, accentuated in the long run trends already present in 1300 and had certain rather decisive and durable impacts on each realm. In Iberia, let's go out to the frontier for a bit. We may take 1492 as a vantage point on developments in the late Middle Ages. In January of that year, a crusading army entered Granada, and the last Muslim stronghold fell. From one way of telling the story, we might say this was the end of the centuries-long Reconquista. In March of that year, Ferdinand and Isabella issued a decree requiring the Jews of Castile and Aragon to convert or depart. Now, conditions had often been difficult for the Jews in Spain, but this act ended centuries of rich Jewish, Muslim, Christian interaction in Spain and poisoned the environment in Iberia for what had once and long been a flourishing Jewish community. In April, Isabella commissioned Cristoforo Colombo to discover and acquire islands and mainlands in the ocean sea. In other words, to begin a process of exploration and discovery. Now we're going to come back to these voyages of exploration and discovery in a later lecture. For now, let's just say, and it certainly will not have been Ferdinand and Isabella's intention at the moment, but their action in commissioning Columbus's voyages initiated the globalization of Western civilization. That, again, is one of those things that we can see in hindsight. I don't want to attribute that to Ferdinand and Isabel. Now, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel or Isabella of Castile married in 1469 and, as a result, brought a unification of the two great realms of Iberia. Now, this, of course, was a realm where, as we noticed earlier, from the 13th century on, crown and nobility, abetted often by the church, abetted as well by economic expansion, had been building effective government for 3 centuries. What Ferdinand and Isabel had an opportunity to do was to rule over more territory more efficiently and more effectively than their predecessors had ever been able to do before. But we may say, again, that the basic trends in evidence in the 13th century were going to persist, were not deflected onto new paths in the Iberian Peninsula. We might also just begin to say that by the end of the 15th century, we could start to talk about Spain, rather than an Iberia where various cultures and various political entities shared the spotlight with one another. In Italy, the basic tripartite scheme that we have observed in earlier lectures continues apace. German control in the north persisted but grew progressively weaker. In 1494, indeed, the French invaded northern Italy, without, it must be said, lasting consequences, but this is simply to us a reminder of the fact that northern Italy was again and again and again involved with powers from beyond the Alps. Now, in other regions of Italy, if we pause for a moment on the north, the other great development there is the rise of Milan and Florence and Venice. Many other cities, to be sure. You'll recall perhaps in an earlier lecture we had talked about the rise of the communes, of which there were several dozen. That's all true. There continued to be a number of communes in the north. But Milan and Florence and Venice became, in a sense, the Italian superpowers. Now, each of them was wealthy. Each of them was willing to spend wealth on culture. Going to come back to these places in the Renaissance in our next lectures. But their competitions and rivalries were also disturbing and damaging and disruptive for northern Italy. Now, the papacy's control of the center of Italy was severely compromised by the absence of the popes for much of the 14th century in Avignon. What were the popes doing in Avignon? We'll explain that in just a second. Suffice it to say that much of central Italy, where papal authority had often been contested and where it had been effective or ineffective in turns over a long period of time, was very difficult to maintain when the popes weren't even there at all. In southern Italy, the basic trend that we have observed, that is to say, outside interference, continues as it has long been. The South was hotly contested after the failure of German interest in southern Italy by French princes, and then French interests in southern Italy were contested by Aragonese, Spanish we might say, but by Aragonese princes. Now, nobody, I think we could probably say, really effectively, thoroughly controlled southern Italy, but the realm continued to be impacted by outsiders. German development is riddled with paradoxes. The Golden Bull of 1356, for example, might have created a stable sort of, we might say, federal regime among the various conflicting and competing parties in Germany, and indeed a regime which had got itself out from under the thumb of the popes, who always claimed that they had a right to name the German emperors. But instead, what the Golden Bull really did was create a kind of a stable framework for the continuing fragmentation of Germany. You know, if we think back to that Ottonian kingdom that was the most powerful in 10th century Europe, and fast forward to the 17th century, when there were something more than 300 independent political entities of one kind or another existing in the German lands, we have some sense of the degree of fragmentation in Germany. Now, the individual German regions were often prosperous, they were often peaceful, they were often well governed. There were lots of miniature Germanys, but there was no Germany. There was no single German state. There was no effective central government. Yes, there were Holy Roman emperors right through this period. And yes, some of them exerted a lot of influence in the German lands. And yes, some of them were able to exert virtually no influence. But a German state, per se, did not coalesce. Along Europe's eastern frontier, there were three major developments that we can point to. Lithuania and Poland, for example, coalesced into a powerful, stable kingdom on the shore of the Baltic. And this would be, right on into the 18th and very early 19th century, a considerable player in European politics. The Russians, centered on the Grand Duchy of Moscow, finally, in the 14th century, overthrew the Mongols. Actually, by the early 15th century, they began the process in the 14th. By the 15th century, they were able to throw off Mongol authority, and then they began to unite a huge swathe of lands that would become the Russian Empire. Those very Mongols who in the 13th century had put an end to the state of Kievan Rus, the earliest state on Russian soil. In 1453, to come to our third development in the East, the Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople. Finally, the East Roman, the Byzantine Empire, fell. After trials and tribulations aplenty during its 1,000-year course, this empire now fell. Well, it fell to the Turks, who were then able to consolidate a dominant position in the eastern Mediterranean region. And of course, the Turks would hold that position until, as the sick man of Europe, they were finally put to a decent death after the First World War in the 20th century. The first faint stirrings of the modern state system are there in the 15th century. Ecclesiastical affairs can be summarized a bit more briefly. In the year 1305, a Frenchman by the name of Clement V, a Frenchman was elected pope and took the name Clement V, in the hope that he might be able to settle some long-running disputes with the King of France. Now, in the last years of the 13th century, there had been some really intense disputes between the kings of France and the Pope, between King Philip IV of France and Pope Boniface VIII, turning fundamentally on two questions. Could the King of France tax the clergy? Could the King of France haul members of the clergy into his courts of law to answer for what was perceived as criminal conduct, or in one case, treasonous conduct? The church, of course, said, no, can't tax the church, can't mess with the clergy. The king said, I am sovereign in my realm, I cannot tolerate competing jurisdictions. Well, when Pope Boniface VIII died and King Philip IV was still on the throne, the cardinals thought, if we elect a Frenchman, and if that Frenchman settles temporarily on papal property in the south of France near the city of Avignon, then perhaps he will be able to compose his problems with the King of France. Well, much, I think, to everyone's surprise, the popes wound up staying at Avignon until 1378. Now, they didn't have problems with the kings of France over all of that period, but they had lots of other problems. Problems in Italy, where after they'd been absent for a little while, they were no longer entirely welcome to return. Problems because the papal states were collapsing, and therefore the popes didn't have adequate sources of revenue. And partly because as the 100 Years' War broke out, the popes did honestly try to function as honest brokers in this war, though not surprisingly, the English thought the popes favored the French thought the popes favored the English. Other people divided up badly in allegiance. Indeed, much of Europe split right down the middle between how they viewed the popes at Avignon and how they viewed, eventually, as we'll see in a moment, their rivals. Now, the absence of the popes from Rome scandalized many. Writers like, for example, Catherine of Siena and the early humanist patriarchs spoke of the Babylonian captivity of the church, referring to the Babylonian captivity of the Jews in antiquity. Now, attempts to restore the popes to Rome resulted in the Great Schism. A group of cardinals returned to Rome in 1378, elected the Archbishop of Bari as pope, and then immediately a group of French cardinals, remember the popes had been in France now for 3/4 of a century, a group of French cardinals returned to France and elected a different man pope. There are now two popes. There is a schism. There is a split in the church. And Europe's allegiances were divided. Remember, this is during the 100 Years' War. Now, between 1378 and 1417, there were sometimes two and sometimes three men, each claiming to be the legitimate pope. Slowly but surely, scholars at the University of Paris began to work out a doctrine which we call conciliarism. A doctrine that claimed that ultimate authority in the church resided in the councils, conciliarism, and not in the popes itself. Here was an affront to the notion of papal monarchy that had grown with such vigor and vitality in 12th and 13th century Europe. Some churchmen called for frequent councils, while the popes, of course, gradually tried to subvert them. The popes didn't want these councils being called and telling them what to do. Now, eventually, in 1417, one of these councils, that at Constance, put an end to the Great Schism. But the prestige, the reputation, the credibility of the papacy had been damaged. Now, challenges for the official church do not necessarily bespeak a decline of religious sentiment. Writers like Chaucer, for example, were humorously anti-clerical. Some of the religious figures in his stories have become stock-in-trade figures for bad members of the clergy. But Chaucer, if one reads him carefully, is by no means an irreligious or an anti-religious author. He is indeed, in many respects, anti-clerical, but conventionally pious. There was a very broad movement in 14th and 15th century Europe, which we call the modern devotion. Now, it arose in the first place in the Netherlands, and it then began to spread to almost every corner of Europe. This was groups of lay people, sometimes living together in villages or in communities within towns, who began to live together, to eat together on certain occasions, to pray together on certain occasions. In other words, lay people functioning out in the world and taking on some of the characteristics of a monastic community, called the Brethren of the Common Life. Brethren, brothers who lived a common life. And there were sisters of the common life as well. Now, this was also a world that produced sort of spiritual bestsellers of the late Middle Ages, like Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ, one of the most frequently copied and then printed books in all of history. The idea here was that ordinary people could be given a series of reflections on the way Jesus had lived his life, and that they too could then imitate the life of Christ. Now, this was a movement obviously existing parallel with the church. It wasn't in opposition to it, but it was certainly not one inspired by it. There were large-scale heretical movements that challenged both the authority of the church and particular teachings of the church. The Lollards in England, for example, who took their rise from the scholar John Wycliffe, who taught at Oxford University in the 14th century. And the Hussites in Bohemia, who took their inspiration from Jan Hus, who taught in Prague in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. Now, we'll meet both of those figures again in a later lecture. Suffice it to say for now, there were people who challenged both the authority of the church and some of its teachings. Records tell us of huge numbers of pilgrims. And it's interesting, after all, isn't it, that Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is a series of stories allegedly told to one another by pilgrims on their way to the shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury. We find many examples of lay piety, to mention only one, a very familiar devotion to Catholics now, the Rosary. The Rosary grows in prominence in the 14th and 15th centuries. Yes, its origins reach back a little before that, perhaps really to the 12th century, but it's in the 14th and 15th that the Rosary begins to be a very common devotion among Catholics. So we do not find our Renaissance period to be irreligious, although it is a time of anti-clericalism and a time when the formal organized church is experiencing some big problems. Finally, then, the material conditions of life. The most devastating crisis of the age was caused by plague. Now, it must be said in the first place that a series of seasons of bad weather, of poor harvests, and of famine between 1315 and 1322 weakened Europe severely, put a final and definitive end to the great demographic and economic expansion of the preceding centuries, and serve as an important prelude to the conditions in which, just 20-some years later, the Black Death, a severe outbreak of bubonic plague, the first great plague in Europe in some 600 years, would have its effect. So the plague did not come to a Europe that was already thoroughly prosperous, happy, productive, and so on. It came to a Europe that had been severely weakened in the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322. Now, the story of the Black Death can be told relatively briefly. It appears the plague is carried by fleas that inhabit rats that get onto ships. Ships travel widely. The rats get off the ships. The fleas get off the rats and get on people, and the people get plague. Genoese ships appear to have picked up this particular plague in the Black Sea region, probably in 1346 and 1347, sailed to the west, and the plague then begins to spread up the Italian peninsula in 1347 and 8, crosses the Alps, and by 1348, 1349 has spread almost all over Europe. Now, curiously here, and sort of parenthetically we might say, the very fact that the plague spread so fast is an indication to us of the increasing complexity and connectedness of life in this high medieval world. In the earlier Middle Ages, not that many people traveled that far that fast. The plague simply couldn't have spread as far and quick and as effectively as it did. Now, the outbreak of the plague in 1348-9 was serious. That was a big problem, no question about that. But the big problem, or the bigger problem, was that the plague kept coming back, beginning in 1363, and then again and again with alarming frequency until the 18th century. We are here, of course, well before the discovery of the germ theory of disease. People were helpless before this plague. They had no idea why it happened, and they had no idea really how to stop it. Well, the consequences of plague in Europe were many, and they were complex. There was, in the first place, tremendous mortality. 25 to 35% of the population overall. Heaviest concentrations of mortality in cities, in the very productive centers of Europe that we've talked about in a number of earlier lectures, and carrying off large numbers of the young and the most productive urban peoples. And then, of course, the priests and others who went to minister to them. The plague generated a certain amount of anxiety, a certain amount of hysteria, a certain amount of depression. Now, these were not the only sentiments of Renaissance Europe, as we'll see vividly in our next lecture, but these were sentiments that did exist. And sometimes when we look at the artwork and we see scenes of death, scenes of the macabre, scenes of the odd, we might remind ourselves of these conditions of plague. But these conditions of hysteria sometimes manifested themselves violently, sometimes, in other words, not just a manifestation of gloomy paintings, but no, sometimes in appalling attacks on the Jews, who were scapegoated for the plague. It was a time when trade and finance were disrupted, when prices and wages fluctuated wildly and unpredictably all over Europe. It was a time of social insurrections. There were insurrections in England, there were insurrections in France, there were insurrections in many Italian towns, particularly in Florence. In many ways, economic recovery did not come in Europe until the age of European imperial expansion, when enormous amounts of wealth were generated outside Europe, pumped back into Europe, circulated in Europe, and made possible certain kinds of economic growth that had once characterized our expanding Europe of the High Middle Ages. All right, what's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is that Renaissance Europe was a pretty tough place. It was a very difficult time. What we must now turn to is the question of what exactly was this Renaissance, having understood, I hope, a little something about the world against which that Renaissance played itself out.